So now what I'd like to do is read to you directly from William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. I want you to hear in his words what these separatists experienced. Remember, we're talking about 1607, the same year that the Jamestown settlers left. This is the year that the separatists were forced to flee England for Holland. Here's what he says. For these reformers to be thus constrained to leave their native soil, their lands and livings and all their friends was a great sacrifice, and was wondered at by many. But to go into a country unknown to them, where they must learn a new language and get their livings they knew not how, seemed an almost desperate adventure and a misery worse than death. Further, they were unacquainted with trade, which was the chief industry of their adopted country, having been only used to a plain country life and the innocent pursuit of farming. But these things did not dismay them, though they sometimes troubled them, for their desires were set on the ways of God, and to enjoy his ordinances. They rested on his providence, and they knew whom they had believed. Their first attempt to go, they hire an English captain who's to pick them up and take them across, and basically he sold them out. He reported them to the authorities. Before he even turned them into the authorities, he and his sailors robbed them. So again, these guys had packed up everything they owned to head over to Holland, and they wind up with almost nothing left, and they are arrested. Some of the men are held in prison for almost a year, including William Bradford, who was at the time 18 years old. The lad Bradford was held during that time. Their second attempt is made, and again now they've been greatly reduced in their finances, but they make another attempt, and this time they hire a Dutch ship's captain who agrees to meet them at a certain place and time, but again, because it's illegal for them now to leave. So as much as the king wants to harry them out of the land, he says it's actually illegal for them to leave. So they have to make an attempt to sneak away. Well, this time they're concerned about their wives and children being captured, and so they separate. The men go one direction over land to the meetup point, and the ladies are all taken aboard these small ships and down a river to get out to close to the English Channel, I guess, where they were going to meet up. And when the ladies actually moved faster than they had anticipated, and so all the women and children arrived early, and they were kind of out in open water, and it was very rough seas, and they were getting sick and very miserable and cold, so the sailors kind of bring them back into the mouth of the river. Well, they get grounded in the mud, and they're trying to get free, and about the time that they're grounded in the mud, the men are all arriving, the ship is now coming in, and so the ship's captain decides, well, I was supposed to load the women first, but they're grounded, so they can't row out to me, so he sends shallops, small ships, to start loading the men. Well, he gets the men loaded, and then notices that there's this huge company of horsemen that's approaching. In other words, the alarm has gone out that these people are trying to make their escape, and the ship's captain is unwilling to wait for the women. So he takes off. He turns to leave, and despite all of the protests from the men on board, I mean, can you imagine if your family split up and your dad is on board the ship, and now they're turning to go, and mom and all the children are still stranded, and here come the authorities, not knowing what's going to happen to your family. So he takes them on. In the end, what does happen with the women and children is that it becomes kind of a very unpopular move to hold innocent women and children who have nothing and nowhere to go, and their husbands have now escaped to another country. And so in the end, it takes several weeks of processing, but these women are also allowed to leave, and they are sent to Holland. So Bradford tells us that it takes some time, and different people come in different routes and ways, but they are eventually all reunited in Holland to their great joy, he says. Well, let's see what else we have here. Oh, when the men are crossing the sea, so this is, while not only have they just been deprived of their women and children, and now they're having to cross the English Channel alone, and you can imagine the distress that this has caused. But let me read to you this. The next morning, okay, that's about the first boat full in the country, okay. The Dutchman, who was the ship's captain, seeing all of this situation, swore his country's oath, sacramente, and having a fair wind, he weighed anchor, hoisted sail, and sailed away. The poor men already aboard were in great distress for their wives and children, left thus to be captured and destitute of help, and for themselves too, without any clothes but what they had on their backs and scarcely a penny about them, all of their possessions being aboard the bark, now seized. In other words, with the women and children. It drew tears from their eyes, and they would have given anything to be ashore again, but all in vain, there was no remedy, they must thus sadly part. Afterwards they endured a fearful storm at sea. It was 14 days or more before they reached port, just crossing the English Channel. 14 days, 2 weeks they're out there. It says 7 of which they neither saw the sun, moon, nor stars. They were driven so far north they were near the coast of Norway. The sailors themselves often despaired, and once with shrieks and cries gave over all, as if the ship had foundered, and they were sinking without hope of recovery. But when man's hope and help wholly failed, there appeared the Lord's power and mercy to save them. For the ship rose again. In other words, it had gone like under the water, completely underwater. Their eyes and ears, he said, were filled with water. The ship rose again and gave the crew courage to manage her. If modesty permitted, I might declare with what fervent prayers the voyagers cried to the Lord in their great distress, even remaining fairly collected when the water ran into their mouths and ears, and when the sailors called out, "We sink, we sink!" They cried, the pilgrims, with miraculous yet sublime faith, "Yet, Lord, thou canst save. Yet, Lord, thou canst save." So here you have, guys, the sailors, "We sink, we sink," and the pilgrims, "Yet, Lord, thou canst save," crying out, upon which the ship not only righted herself, but shortly afterwards the violence of the storm began to abate, and the Lord filled their afflicted minds with such comfort as but few can understand, and in the end brought them to their desired haven, where the people came flocking, astonished at their deliverance, the storm having been so long and violent. And we now know from historical record they were the only ship to survive that storm and make it across the English Channel. Over and over again, despite their suffering, where there were moments, you guys, where the pilgrims may have said to themselves, maybe we're on the wrong track here. Maybe God's putting these obstacles in our way so we just stop. But they had an inner faith and an inner trust in his providence. That over and over again, these were testings and trials to prepare them for what was to come. And it certainly was. When we see what they're going to endure in Plymouth, all of these trials prepared them for what was yet to come. So they're going to spend now 13 years in Holland. And in the end, they begin to recognize that God is calling them somewhere else, that he is calling them to the New World. One of the primary reasons Bradford lists here, he says, but still more lamentable, and of all the sorrows most heavy to be borne, was that many of the children, influenced by these conditions and the great licentiousness of the young people of the country, the Netherlands, and the many temptations of the city, were led by evil example into dangerous courses, getting the reins off their necks, in other words, throwing off the authority of their parents. Some became soldiers, others embarked upon voyages by sea, and others upon worse courses, tending to dissoluteness and the danger of their souls, to the great grief of the parents and the dishonor of God. So the pilgrims saw that their posterity would be in danger to degenerate and become corrupt. Last reason, he says, and not least, the pilgrims cherished a great hope and inward zeal of laying good foundations, or at least of making some way towards it, for the propagation and advance of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world. There you see it again, just like the same vision that's founded the Jamestown colony is the vision of these Pilgrim Fathers. They want to make some way towards laying good foundations for the propagation and advance of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world. Listen to this. Even though they should be but stepping stones to others in the performance of so great a work. Guys, they were willing to be stepping stones for the gospel. A stepping stone is not glamorous. A stepping stone is exposed in the mud and other people walk on it in order to move the goal forward. And this is what the Pilgrim vision was. For the sake of their children, for the sake of their posterity, they were willing to be stepping stones for the gospel. He talks about how they decide to go to America, about sending their delegates over to meet with the London Company to establish a charter so that they could go and legally settle in the New World. That charter was granted by the London Company. I'm going to show you in a minute on our note sheets. If you recall, we talked about the fact that that the London Company had the southern portion between the 34th and 45th parallels. The London Company had the southern portion, and the Plymouth Company had the northern portion, but they overlapped in here. So where the Pilgrims were aiming was right there. They wanted to go as far north as they could, but still be in the London Company's jurisdiction. And the reason was that Jamestown, the capital, was towards the south. And Jamestown was still practicing, the Anglican faith was firmly ensconced there. So they did not want to be forced to worship outside of their belief system. They wanted to be able to continue to govern themselves. Again, not to have anarchy, but they wanted to be able to retain the liberties that they had gained and to be free to worship as their consciences dictated. So that was their goal, was to get up to the furthest north part of the London Company's jurisdiction. So they make arrangements. They have two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, that they are supposed to leave on. And the day comes for departure, and then we have this record of what happened. Being ready to depart, they had a day of solemn humiliation, pouring out prayers to the Lord with great fervency, mixed with an abundance of tears. And the time being come that they must depart, they were accompanied with most of their brethren out of the city, unto a town called Delfshaven, where the ship lay ready to receive them. So they left that goodly and pleasant city, which had been their resting place for near 12 years. Listen, guys, this is where we get the term. But they knew they were pilgrims. They were on a journey. They knew that for them, they'd been kind of gone from place to place to place. They were pilgrims. And they looked not much on those things, but they lifted up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. They will always and very proudly retain their English heritage. They are known as Englishmen. They retain all the common law of Englishmen. That's one of the reasons they want to leave Holland, is to retain their English identity. So it's not that they're rejecting their English heritage whatsoever. It's that they're saying spiritually they recognize that God has them on a journey, that they are just pilgrims. And I think it's precious when they say they lift up their eyes to the heavens, and that was their dearest country. And that it quieted their spirits. Another account, again, of Bradford at the parting of those that were leaving. Y'all understand, they've suffered together. This group has been through a lot. They've been through that storm. They've been through the separation of the families. Their congregation has grown to about 600 people. Well, only 200 are going. Only 200 are loading up on these ships and taking what small provisions they can, because it's very limited in what you can bring with you. Probably to one chest, like a large kind of cedar chest. That's it. That's all you can bring for your family. So about 200 of the 600 are leaving. And again, these are families that are leaving, families that are separating. In some cases, a brother and his family are staying and another brother and his family are going. But they are a small covenant community, and so this is a painful parting. And their beloved pastor, John Robinson, is not going with them. He's going to stay with the congregation in Delfshaven, and he is basically deputizing Elder Brewster to serve as the spiritual leader in the new colony. This is what Bradford records about the day that they were leaving. He said, "Truly doleful was the sight of that sad and mournful parting, to see what sighs and sobs and prayers did sound amongst them, what tears did gush from every eye, and pithy speeches pierced each heart. That sundry of the Dutch strangers," again, the local people have turned out to watch this whole spectacle, "sundry of the Dutch strangers that stood on the quay as spectators could not refrain from tears. Yet comfortable and sweet it was to see such lively and true expressions of dear and unfeigned love." So as hard as it was, he says, the parting and the tears and the heart-piercing speeches that were given, he said it was a beautiful thing too, to see how this covenant community loved one another and was committed to one another. What's going to happen next is they're going to leave on two ships, and to make a long story very short, the Speedwell was fine for crossing the ocean, but again, they're going to find that they're taken advantage of. This captain really doesn't want to make the trip, and he begins to open the sails up too much so that the boards are leaky. So like the more pressure you put from the sail, oh gosh, it's hard to explain, but it opens the seams up between the boards. So he was purposely causing the speedwell to leak. Well, it cost them 2 months in port over in Plymouth, England. So they come ashore, or they're at the docks there in Plymouth, and recognizing, of course, by now they're not outlaws. They have a charter and they're headed to the New World. But they lose 2 months trying to make repairs to the speedwell, heading back out, having to come back in, and finally abandoning the speedwell. And everybody, now they have to reduce their numbers. They can't take all 200. So we now have 100 and I think 7, I'll get the number for you in a minute, about 107 people, or 102, I think it's 102, that board the Mayflower. Not all of them are separatists. So some of these folks are called strangers, right? But a good number of them are separatists, and this will become, whether you're separatist or not, you're going to come and be part of that Plymouth colony, right? So the Mayflower finally leaves in September, and it won't arrive until November in Plymouth Harbor. Gets around Cape Cod and into Plymouth Harbor in November. So the problem here is they've lost valuable time. And when they arrive now in Plymouth, they're already into winter, so that's going to cause, again, great suffering when they arrive. So if there's anything else I need to tell you there. About the ship, about when they were going over, yes. Okay, so it's not an easy journey either as they travel. After they had enjoyed fair winds and weather for some time, they encountered crosswinds and many fierce storms, by which the ship was much shaken and her upper works made very leaky. This is the Mayflower. One of the main beams amidships was bent and cracked, which made them afraid that she might not be able to complete the voyage. So some of the chief of the voyagers, meaning the William Bradfords and the Brewsters and the John Carvers that were on board, leaders, seeing that the sailors doubted the efficiency of the ship, entered into serious consultation with the captain and officers to weigh the danger, and rather to return than to cast themselves into desperate and inevitable peril. Indeed, there was great difference of opinion amongst the crew themselves. They wished to do whatever could be done for the sake of their wages, being now halfway over on the journey, but on the other hand they were loath to risk their lives too desperately. At length, all opinions, the captains and others included, agreed that the ship was sound under the waterline, and as for the buckling of the main beam, there was a great iron screw that the passengers brought out of Holland, by which the beam could be raised into its place, and the carpenter affirmed that with a post put under it, set firm in the lower deck and otherwise fastened, he could make it hold. Again, the providence of God. He then goes on to say, well, the providence of God in the fact that of all the things that somebody could have brought and put in their chest to bring, somebody brings a great iron screw. For what purpose? We're really not sure to this day. It was not a printing press screw, as has been earlier thought, but possibly for construction or something. But somebody had this, and in the providence of God, that's exactly what they needed at this time, to hold that mass together, to save the lives of all the people on board, and to keep moving forward in their journey. So Bradford says they committed themselves to the will of God and the resolve to proceed. In several of these storms, the wind was so strong and the seas so high they couldn't carry a knot of sail, but they were forced to simply kind of sit still, to hull over for many days. Once, as they thus lay at Hull in a terrible storm, a strong young man called John Howland, he is a servant to the man who'll be the governor, the first governor, John Carver. John Howland, young guy, coming on deck, was thrown into the sea. Now, number one, guys, he was disobedient. So you need to understand that everybody had been ordered to stay below decks because it was so stormy and unsafe. And this young guy just decides he can't stand it one more second, and up on deck he comes. He's going to be thrown overboard, caught and cast into the sea. But it pleased God that he caught hold of the topsail halyards, these ropes that are kind of dragging behind the ship that hang off the sails. He reports it kind of just draped itself over his arm, and he grabs on for dear life. He kept his hold, although he was several fathoms under the water. We can't even see the guy, but he's hanging on for dear life to that rope. And eventually he kept his hold till he was hauled up by the rope, and then with a boat hook he was helped into the ship and saved. And though he was somewhat ill, I can imagine, pretty shaken up from it, he lived many years and became a profitable member both of the church and the Commonwealth. And that is an understatement. I mean, he did live a very long time. In fact, he's the last living male pilgrim to survive, the last living male. And he's going to go on, John Carver, the governor, will die in the first winter. And so this man, even though he was a servant, he inherits the land that had been given to John Carver. So if you go to Plymouth today, I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute, but if you go to Plymouth, you'll see the site where the governor's house sat. But then eventually it was called the Howland House. And then John Howland's going to go on to be a very productive member of society. He's going to have lots of children and thousands and thousands and thousands of descendants. Today there's a society called the John Howland Society. And again, just hundreds of thousands of people in the United States can trace their lineage back to this guy that in the providence of God was saved when he fell overboard. Upon their arrival, things are difficult. It's cold. They described going out in their shallops to explore, and it says the weather was very cold, and it froze so hard that the spray of the sea froze on their coats like glass. But as they're exploring, guys, they're able to find an abandoned Indian settlement. And in that Indian settlement, it says they found 2 of the Indians' houses covered with mats and some of their implements in them, but the people had run away and could not be seen. They also found corn and beans of various colors. These they brought away, intending to give them full satisfaction. In other words, we'll pay them back whenever we should meet with any of them. As about 6 months afterwards, they did. So any accusations that the Pilgrims stole the Indian corn, always their intent was, we need this to survive and we will repay as soon as we should meet anybody, but we haven't even seen anybody. It appears to be abandoned. And guys, it was abandoned. This is another providence of God, that the very place that they landed was where there had been a settlement previously and a plague had swept through. That same plague wiped out the entire settlement there, and it was the settlement of a man named Squanto, a local Indian who had actually been kidnapped several years before. The timing of all this is just, it couldn't be anything but God. Squanto had been removed and taken to Spain, eventually made his way to England, learned to speak English, was educated, and then made his way back. When he arrived back in Plymouth, went to seek out his people and found they'd been wiped out by a plague. So here he is, this English-speaking Indian with no people to attach himself to. He went to another tribe nearby of the Wampanoags. But when the English people arrived, that's who he felt comfortable with. And so we're going to see here in just a moment this another amazing providence of God. Well, I skipped over something. The Mayflower Compact. This is important too. In John Robinson's letter, the pastor wrote a letter to the people to take with him. It's a pretty lengthy letter, so I won't read the whole letter. But in it, one of the things he says is, first, as we are daily to renew our repentance with our God, next, after this heavenly peace with God and our own consciences. So first priority is to be right with God and have a clear conscience. But secondly, we are carefully to provide for peace with all men, especially with our associates. So peace with God and peace with men, that's your goal. That's why you get this, continual reference to the covenant. We're gonna pursue covenant with God and covenant with men. That's what they do with the Mayflower Compact. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but essentially, this is Bradford, and he says, I will turn back a little and begin with a compact or deed drawn up by them before they went ashore, constituting the first foundation of their government. The reason for this was partly the discontented and mutinous speeches that some of the strangers, so not the separatists, but some of the other people that had come amongst them had let fall, that when they got ashore they would use their liberty, that none had power to command them, because the patent had been procured for Virginia and not for New England, that was under the Plymouth Company's jurisdiction. That belonged to another company. So at this point they decide that they have to draw up a compact amongst themselves. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the note sheets in just a second. All right. After this, they find themselves very sick. That first winter is horrific for them. They're going to lose half their number. And again, I have an illustration I'll show you in just a moment. But it says during this time, of the 100-odd persons, scarcely 50 remained after the winter. They lost half their numbers. It says sometimes 2 or 3 people died in a day. And in the times of worst distress, there would be but 6 or 7 people that were well. And they spared no pains night or day, but with great toil and risking their own health, fetched wood, made fires, prepared food for the sick, made their beds, washed their infected clothes, dressed and undressed them. In a word, did all of the homely and necessary services for them which dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure to hear mentioned. But all this they did willingly and cheerfully, without the least grudging, showing their love to their friends and brethren, a rare example and worthy to be remembered. 2 of the 7, these are 2 that don't get sick through the whole time. The 2 that don't get sick are Elder Brewster, their spiritual leader, who has an opportunity here, guys, to actually to serve his congregation beyond the call of duty in a way that makes such an impression on them. And the other is Miles Standish. And Miles Standish is the warrior. He's there. He's supposed to be there to defend them from what's coming without, from native populations. And yet this warrior winds up humbled and emptying chamber pots and cleaning laundry, and does so willingly and cheerfully. It's really an amazing example of, again, the bond of that covenant community. And you can only imagine how much stronger that bond was, having walked through that difficulty together. In the spring, Bradford then records that they noticed some of their tools have been taken, and that he notices finally for the first time that they notice some native peoples kind of skulking around, but that they won't come forward and actually interact with them. But he says, about the 16th of March, a certain Indian came boldly among them and spoke to them in broken English, which they could well understand, but they were astonished at it. At length they understood by speaking with him that he was not of these parts, but belonged to the eastern country, where some English ships came to fish. And with some English people he was acquainted, and he could name several of them. And from them he had gotten his knowledge of the language. Now his name was Samoset, but he said there was another Indian that he'd bring him back, and his name was Squanto. He was a native from these parts, but he'd been in England, and he could speak English even better than Samoset. After some time, and being dismissed with gifts, in a little while he came with 5 more Indians, and they brought back all the tools that had been stolen, and they made way for the coming of their great sachem named Massasoit, who 4 or 5 days later came with the chief, and a friendly peace was made, a peace that would last, guys, for 50 years. I want you to see, too, the John Robinson letter about being in covenant with one another. That's the foundation of the Mayflower Compact, but it's also the foundation of this peace treaty that said we're going to be at peace with those around us. And if you're ever interested, like the terms of the peace treaty are even here recorded. And I wanted to give you just a little bit more about Squanto. Shoot. I can't find it, but William Bradford, in his description of Squanto, calls him a special instrument of God for the preservation of this band, of this little settlement, because not only can he speak English, but he comes to live with the pilgrims. He teaches them how to fish. He teaches them how to plant in this soil, how to grow corn, so that they can prosper. And so again and again, they see the faithfulness of God even throughout their suffering.